Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Lauren Groff's new novel, Matrix, published by Riverhead Books just a couple of weeks ago. This book was also just longlisted for the National Book Award, which is familiar territory for Groff, though this is actually the first I've read of her work. And the reason why I was immediately drawn to this specific book is that I heard that it was a fictional biography of one of my favorite and one of the greatest, honestly, medieval poets, Marie de France. Not only is Marie de France just one of my personal favorites, as I find the stuff that she writes to just be so much fun, so entertaining, but also so smart and witty. I've also done quite a bit of work on her Lais specifically. One of my chapters in my dissertation is actually focused on perhaps her most famous lay, the lay Bis Clave, and its translation from Old French into Old Norse in the collection, which is called the Strangleger. And I'll come back to the historical Marie in just a minute, because I do want to talk about her quite a bit, especially in how Lauren Groff uses the sort of mythos of Marie de France and Marie's body of work to frame this novel, Matrix. So I should say up front that this at times might be less of a strict review of Groff's novel and more of a discussion of the world of Marie de France that Groff is drawing from in an attempt to try to figure out and pinpoint why Groff is deciding to write a fictional biography of Marie de France and why she's doing it in 2021. But let's start by actually talking about the book at hand, because it is a really good book and it does a lot of interesting things with the medieval story world that it delves into. Matrix follows the life of at the start, a young woman named Marie, who is a bastard half-sister of the crown. But at the age of 17, when this novel opens, she is kicked out of the royal court at Westminster in Britain by Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, who in the first chapter tells Marie that she has just been made prioress of an abbey, far, far away from the royal court. The opening lines to this book read, "She rides out of the forest alone, 17 years old, in the cold March drizzle. Marie, who comes from France." Marie in this book is an outcast in every sense of the word. Not only is she illegitimate, she's a bastard, but she doesn't quite conform to any traditional ideals of womanhood. She's not beautiful like Queen Eleanor is, or like how, capital L ladies of the court are supposed to be. Her body, never mind her mind, is antithetical to the ideal of a woman. And for these reasons, she can't be married off to a nobleman, which is sort of the best use of noble women from the perspective of the court, of course. She's also queer in this book. She has all sorts of different relationships with various women, and there's indications that she was a former lover of Eleanor of Aquitaine herself, which is just fascinating to think about. But all of this makes Marie an outcast at court and in the medieval world in which she's living. We get this description of Marie pretty early on, kind of in the confrontation between Marie and Eleanor, right when Eleanor is kicking Marie out of court. Then the hooves on the far bridge and the flight up to Rouen, then across the channel to her legitimate half-sibling's royal court at Westminster, where Marie appalled everyone with her ravenousness, her rawness, her gauche, big-boned body, where most privileges accorded her royal blood she lost due to the faults of her person. Eleanor laughed at Marie's refusal of her favor, mocked her. But, did Marie truly think she would one day be married off? She a rustic gallows bird, 3 heads too tall, with her great rough stomping about, with her terrible deep voice, her massive hands, and her disputations, and her sword practicing? What spouse would accept Marie, a creature absent of beauty, or even the smallest of feminine arts? So in this description, we see that her physical beauty doesn't really match the ideal of what a courtly woman should be. So she's cast out. But she does have, obviously, plenty of positive attributes. We learn just later in that passage, for instance, that she's very good with languages. Clearly, she's very learned. She's very good with languages, both of which she, of course, shares with the historical Marie. And she uses these attributes to go through this really compelling character development throughout this novel as she takes charge of an abbey and transforms it into a really powerful religious house, which fights against both royal power and the male-dominated capital C church. And that's actually one thing that this book does extraordinarily well. It depicts the daily life of an abbess and of nuns with a lot of detail. And it's honestly just one of the better descriptions of that lifestyle that I've read in a fiction book. But as you can probably see, there is this tension throughout this novel between Marie and Queen Eleanor, the abbey that Marie is in, and the royal court on the other hand. And there's some really interesting problems going on here with queerness and stuff like that, of course, as Marie loves Eleanor, and it seems to have been reciprocated for a time. And, this might have been one of the reasons why Marie was kicked out of the court by Queen Eleanor in the first place. But by setting up Marie the abbess and Eleanor the queen as opposing ends, Groff really nicely portrays the power struggle between the church and the state that was ever ongoing in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, there was a unification of church and state, kind of very famously, but these two sides endlessly vied for power. And I will come back to Marie's Abbey at the end in just a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about how Groff uses what we know about Marie de France, the historical Marie de France, in this novel. So for those who may not be familiar with her, Marie de France was a poet in the late 12th century that we really don't know that much about. She has two main bodies of works, though she is argued to be the author of a few different works as well. We won't really get into that here. The two main bodies of work are the Lais of Marie de France, which are a lay is essentially a song or a poem. And we have this collection of lays. There's quite a few of them. And then another collection of works that are attributed to Marie de France are these fables, which are very much based off of Aesop's fables. But here I want to focus primarily on the lays for two reasons. One, because they're the most famous, and I think they're rightfully the most famous. I think they're the best stuff that she wrote. And also just because I really like them. I think they're very good. But before we get there, to situate this all in space and time, what we're dealing with here is the Angevin Empire in Britain, which the Angevin Empire spans basically most of England and a lot of what is now France. This obviously goes back to the Norman conquest. If you're remembering back to your high school history classes, in 1066, where the Normans came and kind of conquered England. But what grew this empire so much was King Henry II, who was the grandson, I believe, of King William the Conqueror, who was at the time, King Henry was the King of England and the Duke of Normandy. He married this insanely wealthy person named Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was previously actually married to King Louis of France before they got an annulment. You couldn't really get a divorce in the Middle Ages, so what would usually happen were these royal couples would go to the Pope to get the marriage annulled, usually on the grounds of consanguinity, meaning they were too closely related. But Eleanor of Aquitaine was, as her name suggests, the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, and she was also the heir to a lot of the lands in Poitiers. She was massively wealthy and massively powerful, and her marriage to King Henry II of England brought all of her lands to this newly formed empire that now spanned, from Hadrian's Wall in the north of England, kind of almost on the border of Scotland, all the way down through Western France. And not only was Eleanor extremely powerful, but she was a very generous patron of the arts, and so was her daughter as well. She's one of the most interesting royal figures of the Middle Ages. Go read more about her if you don't know about her. But what all this means is that there is this fluid movement that I think we often forget about when we study this history. But there's this fluid movement between the island of Britain and the continent. The aristocratic class in England were all speaking Old French in a dialect kind of called Anglo-Norman. But that means that the literature of England, of the island of Britain, for a couple hundred years was predominantly Anglo-Norman, or at least not predominantly, but inside the royal court, it was Anglo-Norman. And thus, if we're studying English literature, well, we have to do a bit of Anglo-Norman as well, because it is so influential. And, if you pick up where Anglo-Norman kind of drops off in the later Middle Ages, we can see the influences of authors like Marie de France on the later English poets. But in this book, history rolls on in the background. We hear of this civil war that started by Henry II's and Eleanor's children, who include Richard the Lionheart and the later King John, of course, the infamous King John. We hear of Saladin taking back Jerusalem in the Crusades, etc. But so it's in this Anglo-Norman empire that this book takes place in this Angevin empire. And what we know about Marie within this empire comes directly from her own texts. And we don't have any other record of her, really. We're not even sure if her name is Marie. That's just what she names herself in one of her lays. But we really can't be certain. She writes in her first lay, Guigemar, which is usually the first in the collection, at least in all the manuscript witnesses that we have. And forgive my pronunciation just up front. I'm going to be trying to use the Anglo-Norman dialect. I've studied Old French. The Old French that was spoken in French is a bit different than what is spoken in England. So I'm using kind of the reconstruction. So it sounds quite a bit different from modern French. But she writes, Où est seigneurs que dit Marie, qui en son temps passe, ne s'abali. Listen, lords, to what Marie says, who does not forget her duty in her time. And this alongside a fleeting reference in the epilogue to her Fables, which just says, Marie I nomme, c'est suis de France. Marie is my name, and I am from France. That's all we really get that identifies her. So we have to remember, though, that in the 12th century, when she was writing, it wasn't really common to name the authors of texts. They had a very different idea in the Middle Ages about things like authorship and originality and all that kind of stuff. But so that's what we're working with. And this does tell us some things about Marie. It tells us that her name's Marie, and that she is thus a woman, and that she's from France, which indicates that she isn't writing in France, right? It wouldn't be a very unique name to say you're Marie from France if you were living in Paris, right? And in fact, we can locate her closer in time and place, because in the prologue to the Lais, she dedicates the Lais to a noble race, a noble king, which is almost certainly King Henry II. And of course, we can center Marie in England based on linguistic evidence and stuff like that. But anyways, this locates her in Westminster, in England, at the royal court, in the second half of the 12th century. And so she's writing for the royal court, and her songs are probably being performed in the royal court. Poetry was always read out loud, usually with music, and in fact there's so many references in the Lais to instruments and music that it was certainly performed with music, but like silent reading to yourself, that's a modern phenomenon. In the Middle Ages, almost all reading was done out loud to a group of people. And there are, to be fair, a lot of other theories about who Marie is. There's a few abbesses named Marie around this time, and people point to some of these different Maries around England and say that that might be the Marie de France that we're working with here. But there's really no scholarly consensus. There's a great book by a scholar named, I believe, Howard Bloch, on all of this, thing called the Anonymous Marie de France, which he covers it all pretty well. But so back to Matrix. In Matrix, Marie decides to write these lays, these songs, in an attempt to win back Eleanor, win back her favor, and to get access back to the royal court, right? She doesn't want to be at this abbey at the start of this book. And like I noted earlier, Eleanor of Aquitaine was a patron of the arts, and she was an absolute lover of the arts. And Marie knows this. We're told Eleanor's best currency is story, love that is given and received through song. And with this in mind, Marie decides to write. What has come to Marie is a Breton lay in rhyming lines, sudden and beautiful in its entirety. Her hands begin to shake in her lap. She will write a collection of lays, translated to the fine musical French of the court. She will send her manuscript as a blazing arrow towards her love, and when it strikes, it will set that cruel heart afire. Eleanor will relent. Marie will be allowed back to the court, to the place where none ever starve, and there's always music and dogs and birds and life, where at dusk the gardens are full of lovers and flowers and intrigue, where Marie can practice her languages and hear in the halls the fiery tales of new ideas shooting through conversations, not just the tripartite god of parent and child and ghost who is talked about here, not all this endless work and prayer and hunger. And so where Marie's genius comes in these lays is what she chooses as her source material. In the prologue to her lays, and I'll just read, just for simplicity's sake for the rest of the video, Claire M. Waters' translation, which is very good and very affordable, published by Broadview, actually a pretty recent translation. very quite good. That's facing page translation and everything. But I'll just read her translation for simplicity's sake. But in the prologue, Marie writes, "Whoever wishes to protect himself from wrongdoing should study and understand and begin a heavy task. Through this, he can further distance himself and deliver himself from great sorrow. Therefore, I began to think of making some good story and translating from Latin to French. But it would hardly be worth it to me. So many others have undertaken it. I thought of Lais that I had heard. I did not doubt, I knew well, that they made them for remembrance, concerning adventures that they heard, those who first began them, and who sent them forth. I have heard many of them told. I do not wish to leave them aside or forget them. I have made rhymes from them and written poems. Many times I have stayed up to it." And so she goes on to, effectively the way she frames it, to translate these Breton lays from Breton into Old French. We don't know if she's actually translating them. She's very clearly doing a bit more than translating. She's creatively adapting these stories, but we don't actually know how much of these stories are based on Breton stories, right? If they were based on Breton stories, it was in the oral tradition, and then Marie is translating them into Anglo-Norman, into Old French or whatever, and performing them for the court. But again, this is a subversion of traditional hierarchies. Not only is she a woman poet, but she's sidestepping Latin and using the vernacular for poetry, which was not the norm in the 12th century. And she's drawing from British sources, or Breton sources, from the outskirts of the cultural landscape. Like the Marie in Groff's novel, the historical Marie was certainly fluent in a bunch of different languages: French, Latin, probably English, and definitely at least one Brythonic language or Celtic language, though no one really uses the word Celtic anymore in scholarship. Some sort of Breton language. And she turns to these Breton or Brythonic story worlds for her stories, which again wasn't a popular move, especially at a royal court made up of Anglo-Norman aristocrats. Most poets at the time were not only working in Latin rather than the vernacular, but they would go back to the Latin classics or the biblical story world rather than the British. The Brythonic languages and their people were a minority in both Britain and on the continent. Even today, you can see you can see that the people and these languages are kind of pushed to the fringes of the island of Britain and in France, right? Think of Wales and Cornwall, or Brittany in France. Marie is working from the outskirts of this empire, but her songs are being performed within the very center of the empire, inside the royal court. And I should note that she isn't the only one to be doing this. The insanely famous, in the Middle Ages, historian Geoffrey of Monmouth also does this a lot in his history, whatever it is, the history of the kings of Britain, the Historia Regum Britanniae. But this world, the Brythonic world, had all of these just fantastic stories of fairies and shapeshifters and this other world, the Fae world, and all stuff like this. Stuff that when we think of medieval literature, we often think of this stuff. And we can thank a lot of medieval authors for that, but Marie might be the one to thank the most, as this move and the influence of this move in the coming centuries really dominate the literary landscape of both Britain and France. This movement of using these Breton or Brythonic story worlds and bringing them into the center, into kind of high society. This was a very important move. And then of course we get what Marie actually writes about in her lays. What makes this collection so much fun, in my opinion, is that Marie focuses on all sorts of different things. She contradicts herself. She expresses all different kinds of worldviews and philosophies. But if we read between the lines of a lot of her stories, we see a poet carefully engaging on multiple levels with the social, courtly, or chivalric world, and often critiquing it or satirizing it at the least. And this subverting presence of Marie de France is probably one of the reasons why Groff thought that it would be a good idea to rewrite a fictional biography of Marie de France in the 21st century. At every turn, Marie defies expectations. In the famous lay Bisclavée, for instance, which is about a werewolf knight who turns into a wolf basically every couple of days without telling anyone until his wife keeps asking him where the hell he goes for multiple days every week. And eventually he tells her. And so she goes, next time he transforms into a wolf, she goes and steals his clothes, which basically trap him in his wolf form. He needs his clothes to turn back into a man for whatever reason. And this story goes on. It's amazing fun. Go read it. But what might look like at the first level, a perhaps moralizing tale about an unfaithful wife who betrays her husband, I think can be read as a scathing critique of the knightly class, thinking of knights as shapeshifters who, when they're in the court, they move around in their pretty uniforms and their polite society, but then they fluidly snap into a wolf form when they're on the battlefield, and they turn into this brutal and bestial and wolfish demeanor in which they kill men and butcher people. Seems to me to be a critique of the facade of knighthood that so many chivalric stories really idealize. Further, Marie writes texts that are unabashedly feminist. She's often described as proto-feminist. The metaphor of aristocratic marriages being trapped in prison, for the woman at least, is depicted in various lays. And in the lay L'Anvil, again, another just personal favorite, it's a fantastic one. The feminine power of this fairy queen not only rivals that of the king, but actually surpasses it, as our protagonist L'Anvil is cast out of King Arthur's court, only to be invited and welcomed into the court of this fairy maiden, who is a much better lord to L'Anvil. She's a much better lord. These lays are, again, just all incredible. I strongly encourage you to read them. Every time I teach them, my students are always so surprised because they feel and they read so modern. This is all to say that Marie has certain themes that a lot of her stories kind of circle. Feminine power, critiques of chivalry, and critiques of the royal court, fidelity or infidelity in marriage, courtly love, knightliness, etc. And she constantly looks at these themes from different angles, often considering different perspectives of all of these. But it's important to remember that all of these themes being explored in these songs are being explored at the center of this chivalric world in the royal court. You know, she isn't critiquing the royal court from outside, she's critiquing it from within. And so she has to be extremely subtle. And so you, the reader, really have to read between the lines. And so Groff, I think, does a really good job using a lot of these themes that the historical Marie was so interested in. We get that fleeting reference, and it's really the only on-the-nose reference to Marie writing these lays, and then it kind of disappears. I do think that Groff could have used the lays a bit more to provide a framework for Marie's life. But with that being said, I think Groff does do a good job of using the themes of the lays quite a bit in this book. And there are other references throughout, right? There's a moment where one of the characters sees a white hind in the woods. That's a reference to Guijamar. There's one character, one female character who doesn't have a nose. Clearly a reference to Bisclavet. And so I do think that if we read carefully, we can see that Groff does allude to a lot of these lays. So their themes remain, even if the particulars of a lot of the stories kind of fade away. It seems that Groff didn't want to be trapped by the lays themselves, which, to be fair, is very Marie de France of her. The last thing I want to look at, though, in this video is how Groff portrays feminine power in Matrix. As I noted earlier, Marie at the start of this novel is kicked out of the royal court, and she is forced to join an abbey, a religious house. And this is where she spends the majority of her life, and this is where the majority of the book takes place. And like I said earlier, Lauren Groff just does an incredible job recreating this life. It's very, very detailed. I mean, you can really tell that she's read her Marjorie Kemp and Julian of Norwich, as Marie in Matrix becomes a subversive religious woman who upsets the traditional patriarchal system of the church. Marie quickly becomes the abbess, right, the leader of the church. And I should note that abbeys in the Middle Ages were usually either split into two separate halves, one side for monks and the other side for nuns, ruled over by an abbot and an abbess, respectively. Or these abbeys were simply all monks or all nuns. The one that Marie is at is all nuns, and she is the abbess. She's the ruler. And as I just alluded to, Lauren Groff is clearly drawing heavily from these two titans of late medieval religious writing, Marjorie Kempe and Julian of Norwich, who again, I'll just say, go read. It doesn't seem like reading religious mystics from the Middle Ages would be entertaining, but I guarantee you will be pleasantly surprised with how subversive these two writers are. Julian of Norwich in particular, in her Revelations of Divine Love, was a religious mystic who, for example, stressed the connection between divine love and motherly love, essentially arguing that God is mother. And Groff just uses this expertly. Marie has a few visions throughout this book. They kind of keep coming back to her. And each of these visions are of the Virgin Mother of God, Mary, who in the Middle Ages at least was often the most important figure in the Christian pantheon. And I want to quickly look at the second vision in Groff's novel, because it isn't just of Mary, but of Eve, the first woman, as well. And again, in a very Julian of Norwich way, she relates this vision, explaining that she was standing in this forest when two women appeared in front of her, both looking just absolutely magisterial. Mary, though, has a large wound on her breast, which Marie understands to be the wound of maternal sorrow. And Eve, in one hand, is holding a rib, but the rib is made out of crystal. And Marie again interprets this, that she, Eve, was a refinement of the first mortal made of mere clay. And these two women hold hands, looking at Marie, and I'll just read. The women gazed upon me in silence, and with faces full of love. And when I could at last dare to fix my gaze upon them, and did not dare to drag my eyes away, they raised their clasped hands, and kissed. Let her kiss her, with a kiss of her mouth. Thus they showed me that the war so often vaunted between them was a falsity created by the serpent to sow division and strife and unhappiness in the world. For I saw it was from Eve's taste of the forbidden fruit that knowledge came, and with knowledge the ability to understand the perfection of the fruit of Mary's womb and the gift given to the world. And without the flaw of Eve, there could be no purity of Mary. And without the womb of Eve, which is the house of death, there could be no womb of Mary, which is the house of life. Without the first matrix, there could be no salvatrix, the greatest matrix of all. And when I saw this all clear, the two women stood as one and rose up from where they stood in the dead brush of the winter forest, and together they rose up in a slow and shining band of light to the heavens. It's just beautiful for one, but two, it's just such an interesting reading of both Eve and the Virgin Mother and the Immaculate Conception and all of that. She really kind of restructures this narrative of what these two women represent. So Marie becomes abbess of this abbey, and she wields her feminine power. Again, her abbey is made up of only women, and Marie recognizes the importance of this, as they have this little kingdom that is really more or less outside of the patriarchal system of the medieval world. It's a small kingdom, and Marie is queen, and more importantly though, she is mother. There would be no authority but Marie's authority in this place, and they could stay on this piece of earth where the place has always stood, but her daughters would be removed, enclosed, safe. They would be self-sufficient, entire unto themselves, an island of women. Marie's Abbey is this feminist utopia, right? It's Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland, just 600 years before. So this book was really a pleasant surprise. This isn't the kind of book, admittedly, that I would usually go for right away. But Groff really did her research. I saw an article where she spoke a little bit about the medievalists that she consulted, which was actually really quite interesting. And Groff's sentence level writing, again, I found to be really good, really beautiful. She did a lot in this fictional biography, and I think that she did Marie well. Marie de France, I think, just deserves more recognition in the modern world. Her poems or her songs are really something else. And I think that Groff did an exceptional job mirroring Marie, which I hope leads more people to not only read Lauren Groff's Matrix, but leads more people to read Marie de France herself. So let me know what you think of Lauren Groff's Matrix. I think it's well worth checking out. But for now, thanks for watching.